The morning of April 17th, 1944, over the industrial haze of Brunswick, Germany, Lieutenant Werner Hoffman pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a shallow dive and waited for the inevitable. The American P-38 Lightning above him had altitude, position, and the twin-engine speed that made it one of the most feared interceptors in the European theatre. Hoffman had seen this scenario play out a dozen times. The Lightning would commit to the dive, build speed past 500 miles per hour, and somewhere around 18,000 feet, the American pilot would lose control. The aircraft would either shake itself into a death spiral or pull up frantically to avoid compressibility lockup. Either way, Hoffman would escape. Except this time, something was wrong. The P-38 dove after him, closing fast. Hoffman steepened his descent, standard procedure. 15 seconds passed. The Lightning should be fighting its controls by now. Instead, it remained rock steady, closing to 400 yards, now 300. Hoffman's hand moved instinctively toward his control stick, preparing for evasive maneuvers. Then he heard it, a change in the sound of the American aircraft, a shift from the distinctive twin-engine roar to something asymmetric, uneven. One of the Lightning's engines had stopped, not failed, stopped, deliberately. The P-38 was still diving, still tracking him with unnatural precision, and now it was close enough that Hoffman could see the pilot's head in the cockpit. At 200 yards, the Americans' guns began firing. Hoffman broke hard right, but the geometry was already wrong. He'd stayed in the dive too long, confident in a tactical advantage that had simply vanished. The .50 caliber rounds walked across his wing route. His aircraft shuddered, trailing smoke. He nursed the damaged fighter back toward his base, mind racing with a single impossible thought. The Americans had found a way to make their aircraft weaker, and somehow, that made them deadlier. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By the spring of 1944, every Luftwaffe fighter pilot defending the Reich knew the P-38 Lightning's fatal weakness. It was written in tactical bulletins, discussed in ready rooms, and proven in combat encounters from France to Poland. The twin-boom American fighter, despite its impressive specifications and intimidating appearance, could not sustain high-speed dives without losing control. The phenomenon was called compressibility, though most German pilots didn't fully understand the aerodynamics. They didn't need to. They only needed to know it existed and how to exploit it. The tactical doctrine was elegantly simple. When jumped by Lightnings from above, execute a moderate dive between 30 and 40 degrees. The pursuing P-38 would either have to pull up early, letting you escape, or commit to a steeper dive angle to close the distance, which would push the American aircraft toward the speed where its controls froze and the pilot became a passenger in a falling machine. From October 1943 through March 1944, this tactic had worked with brutal consistency. German fighter units reported multiple instances of P-38 seconds breaking off attacks at critical moments, or, more rarely, losing control entirely and diving into the French countryside or the English Channel with no enemy fire involved. It had become so reliable that Luftwaffe training documents specifically mentioned it. When engaged by P-38 Lightnings at altitude, defensive diving tactics are highly effective due to known American aircraft control deficiency above 450 miles per hour. American pilots knew they were being exploited. They knew the Germans had figured out the compressibility problem and were using it as a weapon. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, of the 56th Fighter Group, described the psychological weight in his diary entry dated February 3, 1944. Every time we dive on them, there's this voice in your head calculating altitude, speed, control, feel. You're not thinking about your gun sight or your tactics. You're thinking about whether your airplane is about to kill you. The Germans know this. You can see it in how they fly. They're not afraid of us anymore. That last observation cut deepest. The P-38 had arrived in Europe with a reputation forged in the Pacific theatre, where it had proven devastatingly effective against Japanese aircraft. It looked like nothing else in the sky. Twin engines, twin booms, a central nacelle that gave it a science fiction profile. It could cruise at speeds that left German fighters gasping and climb to altitudes where the air was so thin that enemy pilots struggled to breathe. But all of that meant nothing if the aircraft killed you for being aggressive, if it punished the very instinct that made you effective in combat. The solution, when it emerged, didn't come from Lockheed's engineering team in Burbank, California. It didn't come from the Army Air Force's technical staff or from high-level tactical conferences. It came from a captain named Ralph Wandry, flying his 30-second combat mission over occupied France, with a German fighter on his tail and about 3 seconds to live. March 11, 1944, 23,000 feet over Reims. Wandry had bounced a pair of FW-190 fighters that were climbing back to altitude after strafing Allied positions. He'd gotten his nose ahead of the trailing German and fired a burst that missed, and now both 190s had reversed on him. The lead fighter was diving away in the standard German defensive pattern. Wandry followed, pushing his Lightning into a 40-degree dive. His airspeed climbed through 400 miles per hour, 420, 440. His wingman called out a warning over the radio. Wandry knew what was coming. In about 15 seconds, at this dive angle, his controls would start to stiffen. By 490 miles per hour, he'd be fighting the aircraft instead of flying it. The German pilot would escape. Again, something broke in Wandry's mind that day, not psychologically, but cognitively. A barrier between trained procedure and desperate innovation shattered. His left hand, which had been gripping the throttles to maintain power in both Allison engines, made a decision that bypassed conscious thought. He pulled the left throttle all the way back to idle, then reached down and hit the feathering button for the left propeller. The propeller blades rotated to align with the airflow, stopped spinning, and the left engine shut down completely. The P-38 shuddered as asymmetric thrust tried to yaw it sideways. Wandry's right foot pressed the rudder pedal hard to compensate. The aircraft's dive steadied. The buffeting that had been building in the control surfaces, the early warning of compressibility onset, simply stopped. His airspeed continued to climb, 460, 480, 500 miles per hour, but the controls remained responsive. The Lightning stayed locked on the diving FW-190 like it was flying through thick honey instead of thin air at 20,000 feet. Wandry closed to 300 yards, then 200. The German pilot, certain he'd created enough separation, began pulling out of his dive. Wandry fired. The 50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon poured fire into the 190's fuselage. The German fighter's canopy shattered. Its dive steepened uncontrollably. Wandry watched it disappear into the clouds below, trailing smoke and pieces of aluminum. Then he looked at his instrument panel. Left engine shut down. Right engine at full power. Altitude, 16,000 feet, and dropping. He'd just killed a German fighter while flying on one engine in a high-speed dive, doing something that every regulation, every training manual, and every instinct said was insane. He restarted the left engine, a procedure that took 45 seconds and felt like 45 minutes, with his heart hammering and his hands shaking from adrenaline. The engine caught, the propeller feathered back into normal pitch, and Wandry climbed back toward his formation. His wingman pulled alongside, clearly confused. Wandry's radio was filled with questions. What happened? Did you take damage? Why'd you shut down an engine? Wandry didn't have answers. He had a result. He'd followed a German fighter through a dive past 500 miles per hour and killed it, something that wasn't supposed to be possible in a P-38 Lightning. When Wandry landed back at his base in England, he expected to be debriefed on the victory, congratulated, and sent to his bunk for rest. Instead, he found himself in the squadron commander's office, trying to explain why he'd deliberately shut down an engine during combat without mechanical failure or emergency. Major James Stewart, the squadron operations officer, listened to the explanation with growing fascination rather than anger. Stewart had been flying P-38 seconds since their arrival in Europe. He'd lost friends to compressibility. He'd personally broken off attacks because the aircraft's controls had started to freeze. The idea that deliberately creating asymmetric thrust might somehow prevent the control lockup seemed technically absurd. But Wandry was sitting in front of him, alive, with gun camera footage of a confirmed kill from a dive that should have been impossible. Stewart made a decision that violated protocol, but might save lives. That evening, he gathered the squadron's most experienced pilots in an unofficial briefing. Wandry explained what he'd done, why he'd done it, and more importantly, what it felt like. The asymmetric thrust forced you to hold rudder pressure the entire dive, which was exhausting. You lost some ability to maneuver laterally because the working engine wanted to pull you sideways. Restarting the shutdown engine while climbing back to altitude required precise timing and left you vulnerable for almost a minute, but the controls stayed responsive past 500 miles per hour. The buffeting stopped. The dive remained controllable. 3 pilots volunteered to test the technique the next day on a training flight. They took their P-38 seconds up to 25,000 feet, shut down one engine, and dove. All 3 reported the same result. With asymmetric thrust, the aircraft remained stable well past the speed where compressibility normally onset. The technique worked. Within a week, half the squadron had tried it. Within 2 weeks, pilots were using it in combat. The official Army Air Forces didn't know this was happening. There were no technical bulletins, no formal doctrine changes, no engineering analysis. This was spreading through the most powerful communication network in any military, pilots talking to pilots. When squadrons rotated back to England for rest, crews would drink at the officers' club and trade stories. Someone would mention this crazy technique where you shut down an engine in a dive. Someone else would say they'd heard about that too. Did it actually work? Yeah. Apparently Johnson from the 362nd used it last week and splashed a 109. By April 1944, at least 4 different P-38 squadrons were using single-engine diving tactics, none with official authorization, all because pilots had decided that survival mattered more than regulations. The Luftwaffe noticed, though it took them several weeks to understand what they were seeing. The first reports came from gun camera footage recovered from German fighters that had been shot down. Luftwaffe intelligence officers reviewing the film noticed something peculiar in several sequences. P-38 seconds that should have been experiencing compressibility problems, based on their dive angles and apparent speeds, were tracking targets with unsettling precision. In some frames, close observation revealed that one of the Lightning's propellers appeared stationary while the other was clearly spinning at full power. Initially, intelligence officers assumed these were damaged aircraft, making desperate attacks before they crashed. But when similar footage appeared from 3 separate engagements over a 2-week period, patterns emerged. These weren't damaged aircraft. The engines were being shut down deliberately, and the pilots were using this bizarre configuration to maintain control at speeds that should have been impossible. Oberleutnant Friedrich Lang, a Luftwaffe tactical analyst stationed at Luftflotte 3 headquarters, wrote an assessment dated May 2, 1944. American P-38 pilots have developed an unorthodox technique involving deliberate engine shutdown during high-speed diving attacks. This appears to mitigate the control deficiency we have successfully exploited for 6 months. The tactical implications are significant. Our defensive diving tactics may no longer provide reliable escape against lightning attacks. Lang's assessment was professionally understated. The tactical implications weren't just significant, they were catastrophic for German pilots, who'd built their survival around exploiting the P-38's weakness. For 18 months, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had operated with a crucial advantage: the knowledge that American Lightnings couldn't follow them through certain types of dives without risking control failure. This advantage had been drilled into training, incorporated into tactical doctrine, and proven repeatedly in combat. Now, suddenly, unpredictably, it was evaporating. The psychological impact hit German pilots harder than the Americans had experienced their own compressibility crisis. At least American pilots knew their aircraft's limitation was inherent to the design. They could plan around it, avoid situations where it mattered, or eventually, as they'd now discovered, develop techniques to mitigate it. Their tactical advantage had been neutralized by an enemy willing to make themselves technically weaker, flying on one engine to achieve a combat result. It violated conventional military logic. You didn't reduce your own capability to gain an advantage. You maximized every asset. Yet here were American pilots deliberately shutting down half their propulsion in the middle of combat and winning because of it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Major Josef Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the most experienced fighter units defending the Reich, received Lang's assessment with grim recognition. Priller had over 100 confirmed victories and had survived since 1940. He'd seen tactics evolve, seen aircraft improve, seen the Luftwaffe's advantages erode month by month. But this felt different. This wasn't about better American aircraft or improved pilot training. This was about the Americans being willing to break their own rules. Priller issued new engagement guidelines to his unit on May 9, 1944. When engaged by P-38 seconds with altitude advantage, do not assume standard diving defense will succeed. American pilots are using asymmetric engine configuration to maintain control at high speeds. Execute immediate hard brakes followed by low-altitude separation rather than sustained dives. Be prepared for lightning pursuit to continue past previously safe speeds. The new guidelines worked sometimes. German pilots, who broke hard and violently when initially bounced, could force P-38 pilots into turning engagements where the single-engine configuration created handling problems. But the guidelines couldn't solve the fundamental problem. The psychological safety net that diving defense had provided was gone. Every engagement now carried additional uncertainty. Would this P-38 pilot use the technique? Would he commit deep enough that you couldn't escape? The mental calculation that German pilots had to perform in the seconds after being bounced had become vastly more complex, and complexity in air combat killed you. Lieutenant Heinrich Sturm, a pilot with Jagdgeschwader 3, recorded his experience in a letter dated May 24, 1944, discovered decades later in family archives. We used to know what the Lightnings could and couldn't do. That knowledge was like armor. Now we know they can do things that seem impossible, flying on one engine while diving faster than we can run. The Americans are either very brave or very crazy, and I can't decide which is more frightening. Sturm's observation touched on something that American pilots themselves were grappling with: the single-engine dive. Technique required a specific type of courage, not the aggressive bravery of attacking overwhelming odds, but the cold, calculated courage of deliberately making your aircraft vulnerable because the math said it would work. Every pilot who used the technique had to overcome powerful instincts. Shutting down an engine in combat felt wrong at a visceral level. You were reducing your power, limiting your options, creating a single point of failure. If the remaining engine took damage, you were flying a glider over hostile territory. If you misjudged the dive and had to maneuver aggressively, the asymmetric thrust could put you into an unrecoverable situation. Captain Thomas Watkins of the 479th Fighter Group was shot down on May 6, 1944, and captured by German forces. During interrogation at Auswärterstelle West, the Luftwaffe's primary intelligence center for captured Allied airmen, Watkins eventually discussed the single-engine technique. The German interrogators were professionals, skilled at extracting information through seemingly casual conversation rather than coercion. They noticed that Watkins carried a small notebook with handwritten procedures for various emergency situations, including a section titled High-Speed Dive, Single-Engine Technique. Over several days, the interrogators coaxed details from Watkins. He described the procedure, the rudder pressure required, the vulnerability during engine restart, the limitations it imposed on maneuvering. He maintained that he'd only used it once and didn't fully understand the aerodynamic principles that made it work. That partial information was enough. By mid-May 1944, the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe issued tactical bulletins to fighter units throughout the Reich, warning that American P-38 pilots were deliberately shutting down engines during dive attacks. The bulletins recommended more aggressive initial defensive brakes, steeper dive angles to force Americans into commitment before they could employ the technique, and immediate hard-turning maneuvers once the P-38 closed to firing range, since the single-engine configuration reduced the Lightning's ability to follow in high-G turns. Jagdgeschwader 26 adapted their tactics within days. They'd been among the first units to exploit the P-38's compressibility problems, and they were now among the first to adapt to its solution. The adapted German tactics had mixed effectiveness, and the reason revealed something fundamental about asymmetric warfare. The single-engine technique had shifted the tactical equation, but it hadn't broken it entirely. German pilots who executed immediate violent brakes when bounced could still escape, particularly if they recognized the threat early. But recognition itself became a problem. In the chaos of air combat, with multiple aircraft swirling through three-dimensional space, identifying which P-38 seconds were using single-engine configuration and which weren't was nearly impossible until they were already in firing range. By then, it was often too late. On June 12, 1944, 6 days after the Normandy invasion, a large air battle developed over the beachhead, involving elements of 3 P-38 groups and multiple German fighter units. The Americans claimed 14 confirmed victories for the loss of 3 P-38 seconds. German records, meticulously maintained even as their situation deteriorated, confirmed 11 fighters lost in that engagement. Post-battle analysis showed that at least 7 of those German losses came from P-38 seconds using single-engine diving attacks. The remaining kills came from conventional tactics, but the psychological impact extended beyond the kill ratio. German pilots who survived the engagement reported a consistent theme in their debriefings. They described feeling uncertain, unable to predict whether diving defense would work, forced to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. Several pilots mentioned breaking off attacks or disengaging from advantageous positions because they couldn't tell whether the pursuing P-38 seconds would be able to follow them or not. Uncertainty breeds hesitation, and hesitation in air combat creates casualties. The Luftwaffe's tactical advantage against the P-38 hadn't just been neutralized, it had been transformed into a psychological disadvantage. What made the situation more complex for German pilots was that not all American P-38 pilots used the technique. Some squadrons had adopted it widely, others remained skeptical or had commanders who forbade its use without official authorization. Individual pilots within the same squadron made different choices based on their comfort level with the risk. This inconsistency made the technique more effective, not less. If every P-38 had used single-engine dives, German pilots could have adapted their tactics uniformly. Instead, they faced a lottery. Able to follow through a high-speed dive, and you wouldn't know until you were committed to the defensive maneuver, and it was too late to change your mind. Lieutenant Werner Hoffman, the pilot who'd encountered the technique on April 17th, survived until July 1944, when his Messerschmitt was shot down by P-51 Mustangs over Munich. Before his death, he'd filed 5 separate after-action reports mentioning encounters with P-38 seconds using asymmetric engine configuration. His final report, dated July 2nd, included an observation that Luftwaffe intelligence found deeply troubling. The Americans are no longer afraid of diving after us. They pursue with confidence that was absent 6 months ago. Our defensive tactics require them to fear their aircraft's limitations. They no longer do. We have lost the psychological advantage. Hoffman's assessment identified the technique's most significant impact, which wasn't tactical or technical, but psychological. For American P-38 pilots, the single-engine dive method represented liberation from the fear that had defined their combat experience for over a year. They'd spent 18 months flying an aircraft that punished aggression, that killed pilots for trying to press home attacks, that forced them to break off at the moment when closing for the kill mattered most. The technique, dangerous and unorthodox as it was, gave them back their agency. They could choose to commit to a diving attack and see it through. The aircraft would respond to their inputs instead of betraying them. Captain Ralph Wandry, whose desperate improvisation had sparked the technique's development, flew 37 more combat missions before rotating back to the United States in August 1944. In a debriefing conducted at 8th Air Force headquarters, he was asked whether he'd been afraid the first time he shut down an engine in combat. His response was recorded in the session notes. "I was already afraid. We were all afraid of what our own aircraft would do to us if we pushed it too hard. Shutting down the engine was just choosing a different kind of fear. one where I had some control over the outcome. That made all the difference. That distinction between fear imposed by circumstances beyond your control and fear chosen as part of calculated risk defined the technique's psychological impact. Pilots who used it reported feeling more confident in combat, not because their aircraft had become safer, but because they'd proven to themselves they could adapt, improvise, and overcome limitations through skill and decision-making. The P-38 remained a flawed aircraft with genuine handling problems at high speeds, but those problems had been transformed from an absolute barrier into a manageable challenge that could be worked around through pilot technique. The official United States Army Air Forces eventually acknowledged the single-engine diving tactic in a technical bulletin dated July 28, 1944, nearly 4 months after pilots had begun using it in combat. The bulletin, distributed to all P-38 units in the European theatre, carried the bureaucratic title Alternative High-Speed Dive Procedures for P-38 Aircraft. It outlined the technique with clinical precision, the procedures for engine shutdown, propeller feathering, rudder compensation, and engine restart. It included warnings about the technique's limitations and situations where it should not be employed. And buried in the second paragraph was a sentence that must have caused some staff officer considerable discomfort. Field reports indicate this procedure has been employed successfully in combat operations by multiple pilots without prior official authorization. In military bureaucracy, that sentence was as close as institutions came to admitting that the troops had figured something out before headquarters had. The bulletin's publication served 2 purposes. It legitimized what pilots were already doing, removing any question about whether they'd face disciplinary action for violating procedures, and it ensured that the technique would be taught to replacement pilots arriving in theatre, standardizing what had begun as improvisation into accepted doctrine. By September 1944, new P-38 pilots completing training in the United States were receiving instruction on single-engine diving tactics before they ever shipped overseas. The technique that had emerged from one captain's desperate decision had been institutionalized into the training pipeline. But institutionalization came with a cost. When something becomes official doctrine, it loses some of the flexibility that made it effective in the first place. The July bulletin specified exact procedures, recommended altitudes, engine restart protocols, all necessary for safety and standardization, but all of which constrained the adaptive creativity that had generated the technique initially. Some veteran pilots noticed this shift. Lieutenant James Morrison of the 364th Fighter Group commented in a letter home dated October 6, 1944, "The new guys come over here knowing the single-engine dive procedure by the book. They can recite the steps perfectly, but they don't understand when to use it and when not to. They think it's just another technique in the manual, not something you pull out when the situation demands innovation. We're teaching them the what and the how, but we're not teaching them the why." Morrison's observation touched on a tension that exists in all military organizations between standardization and adaptation. Standardized procedures ensure baseline competence and reduce the likelihood of catastrophic individual mistakes. But they can also reduce individual initiative and the kind of tactical creativity that produces breakthrough innovations. The single-engine dive technique existed in an uncomfortable space between these poles. It had been born from individual creativity operating outside official channels. Its effectiveness depended partly on German uncertainty about when and how it would be employed. Once it became standardized doctrine, some of that unpredictability vanished. The Germans adapted their tactics throughout the fall of 1944, though their ability to do so was increasingly constrained by broader strategic collapse. Fuel shortages meant less training time for replacement pilots. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Manufacturing priorities had shifted toward jet fighters and other advanced aircraft, reducing the availability of conventional fighters. Even perfect tactics couldn't compensate for being outnumbered 5-1 by an enemy with better training, more fuel, and complete air superiority. The Luftwaffe's situation by late 1944 was hopeless, regardless of how individual fighter pilots handled P-38 encounters. But, in the specific tactical domain of P-38 versus German fighter engagements, the single-engine technique continued to matter. On November 3, 1944, during a massive air battle over Mersburg, P-38 seconds from the 344th Fighter Group engaged elements of Jagdgeschwader 3. The Americans were escorting B-17 bombers attacking synthetic oil facilities. German fighters attacked the bomber formation in waves, and the P-38 seconds dove to intercept. Multiple American pilots used single-engine diving tactics. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, the Americans claimed 9 confirmed kills. German records documented 7 fighters lost. 3 P-38 seconds were shot down, 2 by German fighters and 1 by flak. Lieutenant Karl Hoffman, no relation to Werner, survived that battle and was interviewed after the war by American historians compiling combat records. He described the engagement with the kind of clinical detail that comes from processing traumatic memories through technical analysis. We saw the lightnings diving from above. Standard situation. We broke and dove, but several of us noticed that some of the P-38 seconds were flying asymmetrically, one propeller feathered. We knew what that meant by then. Those aircraft would be able to follow us through the dive. So we had to decide instantly, continue the dive and hope we could outturn them at lower altitude, or break hard immediately and sacrifice our attack on the bombers. Several of us chose different options. The ones who continued the dive, 3 were shot down. The ones who broke early survived but failed to engage the bombers effectively. Either choice meant failure. The Americans had put us in a position where there were no good options. Hoffman's description crystallized the technique's ultimate impact. It hadn't made the P-38 invincible or transformed it into the dominant fighter over Europe. The aircraft still had limitations. Pilots who used the single-engine technique still faced risks, still got shot down, still died. But the technique had eliminated a specific, exploitable weakness that German pilots had relied upon for tactical advantage. More importantly, it had forced German pilots into a mental space where they had to make complex decisions under extreme time pressure with incomplete information, and that cognitive burden degraded their combat effectiveness more reliably than any weapons system could. By December 1944, the P-38's role in the European theatre was already shifting. The P-51 Mustang had proven itself as a superior long-range escort fighter, combining excellent high-altitude performance with better handling characteristics and no compressibility issues at the speeds where the Lightning struggled. P-38 units were increasingly tasked with ground attack missions, supporting advancing Allied armies rather than engaging in air-to-air combat. The single-engine diving technique became less relevant as the aircraft's mission changed. But for the pilots who'd flown P-38 seconds during that critical period from spring to fall 1944, the technique represented something that transcended tactical considerations. It was proof that they could adapt, that they could find solutions to problems that engineers and commanders hadn't solved, that they could take an aircraft with genuine flaws and make it effective through skill and creativity. Captain Daniel Webster of the 55th Fighter Group, who'd flown 73 combat missions in P-38 seconds, reflected on this in a post-war interview conducted in 1947. The Lightning wasn't the best fighter in Europe. Everyone knew that. But it was our fighter, and we figured out how to make it work. The single-engine thing, that was us solving a problem that Lockheed couldn't solve in the design phase. We didn't wait for a better aircraft. We made the aircraft we had into something better. That's what I'm most proud of, not the kills or the missions, but that we adapted. Webster's pride was justified, but it was also incomplete. The adaptation he described hadn't just been about making a flawed aircraft more effective. It had been about transforming the psychological relationship between pilot and machine. Military aviation had always involved trusting your aircraft to behave predictably, to respond to your inputs in ways that matched your training and expectations. The P-38's compressibility problem had shattered that trust for over a year. Pilots had flown an aircraft that betrayed them at critical moments, that turned lethal when pushed to its limits. The single-engine technique required rebuilding trust on different terms, accepting that the aircraft had limitations, but discovering that those limitations could be worked around through unconventional methods. This psychological transformation had implications that extended beyond the P-38 program. It contributed to a broader shift in how the United States military thought about the relationship between operators and equipment. The pre-war assumption had been relatively simple. Engineers designed equipment to certain specifications. Operators were trained to use that equipment within its design parameters, and problems were solved through improved design in subsequent models. The P-38 experience demonstrated that operators could identify solutions that designers hadn't anticipated, that field improvisation could solve problems faster than engineering redesign, and that the gap between design intent and operational reality could be bridged through adaptive tactics rather than just through improved hardware. This lesson influenced post-war aircraft development in subtle but significant ways. The process for gathering feedback from operational pilots became more systematic and more rapid. The assumption that designers knew best and operators should simply adapt to whatever they were given eroded. The cultural divide between engineering and operations, never absolute but certainly present, became more permeable. None of this happened quickly or dramatically. Military culture changes slowly, weighted by tradition and bureaucracy. But the P-38 single-engine technique contributed to a gradual shift toward viewing operators not just as users of equipment, but as partners in discovering how equipment could be employed most effectively. The technique also influenced how the Luftwaffe thought about tactical adaptation, though their ability to act on those lessons was limited by Germany's deteriorating strategic position. German intelligence officers studying American air combat tactics noted a pattern of rapid adaptation and knowledge sharing that seemed to operate faster than official channels. Techniques appeared in combat, spread across units, and became standardized doctrine within weeks rather than months. This contrasted with Luftwaffe experience, where tactical innovations often remained confined to individual units, took months to propagate through official training systems. A post-war analysis conducted by former Luftwaffe officers for U.S. Army Air Forces, historical projects identified the single-engine diving technique as an example of what they termed distributed tactical innovation, where solutions emerged from multiple points in an organization simultaneously, rather than being imposed from central authority. The analysis noted that American squadron and group commanders seemed to have more latitude to authorize experimental tactics without seeking higher approval, and that successful experiments were communicated laterally between units through informal networks rather than waiting for top-down dissemination. Whether this assessment was entirely accurate or reflected German assumptions about American military culture is debatable, but it revealed how the Luftwaffe perceived American tactical evolution as faster, more flexible, and more responsive to field conditions than their own systems. The final combat use of the single-engine diving technique in Europe occurred on May 2, 1945, 5 days before Germany's surrender. Lieutenant Robert Chandler of the 474th Fighter Group was flying a ground attack mission near Prague when his flight encountered a pair of FW-190 fighters attempting to strafe retreating German columns. Chandler and his wingman had altitude advantage. They dove to attack. The German fighters broke and dove in the defensive pattern that had once been so effective against P-38 seconds. Chandler shut down his left engine, feathered the propeller, and followed through the dive. He closed to firing range and shot down one of the FW-190s. The other escaped. Chandler's after-action report, filed later that day, was routine and brief. Engaged 2 enemy aircraft, employed high-speed single-engine dive procedure, confirmed 1 kill. The report treated the technique as completely ordinary, which by then it was. What had been a desperate improvisation, 13 months earlier, had become standard operating procedure, so routine that it didn't merit special comment. That transformation from innovation to routine is how military organizations preserve and institutionalize tactical lessons. But something is always lost in that translation: the creative desperation that produced the original innovation, the willingness to try something that seemed insane because conventional approaches weren't working, that can't be captured in technical bulletins or training manuals. The P-38 Lightning was withdrawn from frontline fighter service in Europe shortly after Germany's surrender. Most aircraft were either scrapped, sent to the Pacific theater, where they continued to serve effectively in different combat conditions, or retained for specialized reconnaissance roles. The single-engine diving technique became a historical footnote, interesting to aviation historians and former P-38 pilots, but largely unknown to the broader public. No monuments were built to commemorate it. No medals were awarded specifically for its development or use. It simply faded into the vast archive of tactical innovations that shaped World War II's outcome in small, cumulative ways. But for the pilots who'd used it, the technique remained a defining memory of their combat experience. In reunions of P-38 veteran groups held decades after the war, the single-engine dive was a frequent topic of conversation. Pilots compared notes on when they'd first heard about it, when they'd first tried it, what it felt like the first time they deliberately shut down an engine with a German fighter in their gun sight. These conversations revealed a consistent theme. The technique had given them back something that compressibility had taken away. Not invincibility. They'd never had that. Not certainty of survival. No combat pilot ever had that. But agency, the sense that their skill and decision-making mattered, that they weren't just passengers hoping their aircraft wouldn't betray them. Major Ralph Wandry, whose improvisation had started everything, retired from the Air Force in 1963 as a full colonel. He'd flown in Korea and served in various staff positions during the Cold War. In a 1978 interview for an oral history project, he was asked whether he'd ever regretted shutting down his engine that day over Reims in March 1944, given the risk involved. His response was immediate. Regret it? It kept me alive. It kept a lot of us alive. Could it have killed me? Absolutely. But flying a P-38 the conventional way was killing us anyway, just more slowly and more predictably. At least the single-engine technique gave us a choice. In combat, having choices is the difference between being a victim and being a fighter pilot. That distinction between victim and fighter pilot, between accepting limitations and finding ways around them, became part of how P-38 veterans understood their service. They'd flown a flawed aircraft against a skilled enemy in the most hostile skies of World War II. They'd faced a tactical problem that was killing them systematically, and instead of waiting for someone else to solve it, they'd solved it themselves, through desperation, creativity, and a willingness to try something that violated every conventional principle of aircraft operation. The solution hadn't been elegant. It had been dangerous, imperfect, and exhausting to execute. But it had worked. The broader lesson extended beyond aviation tactics or World War II history. It spoke to how humans respond when confronted with impossible situations, when the tools they have aren't adequate for the challenges they face, when conventional approaches lead reliably to failure. Sometimes the solution isn't to wait for better tools or different circumstances. Sometimes it's to use familiar tools in unfamiliar ways, to deliberately accept one kind of risk to avoid another, to trust that innovation born from necessity can accomplish what careful planning couldn't. Werner Hoffman's shocked realization in April 1944, watching a P-38 follow him through a dive that should have been impossible, represented the moment when German tactical superiority in that specific domain evaporated. But it also represented something larger, the recognition that his enemy had changed the rules, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through creative desperation. The Americans had made themselves weaker, flying on one engine, to become stronger. They'd chosen a controlled vulnerability over an uncontrolled one, and in making that choice, they'd transformed a liability into an advantage, fear into confidence, and a flawed aircraft into an effective weapon. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.